Okay, hello everybody. This is Helen Boyd, and you are back with Shoulders of Giants. So this is a series. Gwen Smith, who has been nice enough to say yes to this interview, is here today. And I think this is the fifth one I'm recording. I have a few more lined up, but I'm really excited to join Gwen today, particularly because she's absolutely one of the people who was already doing so much work in terms of the trans movement, and I think is remembered for one thing in particular, but I want to get into all the other things that she was doing at the time. Um, I think it's very difficult to express, like even when Rachel and I showed up in the early aughts, how much had already been established in terms of what people were doing and how they were doing it. So I'm hoping to get at more of the details of what was going on before we showed up, which I asked a lot of questions at the time, but I did not have the technology that we have now. So this series is specifically to get some of that stuff down for the record. So, Gwen, hi.
Howdy.
I was gonna say we've only, I think, ever seen each other in person once during the time that
Probably.
you were in New York. I think
Yeah, yeah.
you were there for the gay
I
and
was there
lesbian
for,
journalist thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. NLGJ I was speaking at. And I believe we went over to Brooklyn and shared some cheesecake.
Yes, we did. I did
I
make
want
sure
to
you
say
went
with
to
Becky
juniors.
Allison. Yeah.
With who?
Or was it Dawn? Was it Dawn or Becky that was with us?
I think it was Dawn.
Yeah, that sounds right.
I could be wrong though. Memory is a tricky thing. I feel like the older you get. I know you were staying with Kate.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna ask the big question first,
Okay.
which is that you're obviously famous for Transgender Day of Remembrance. Um, but you did so many other things. So we'll get more into Tidor in a minute, but I would love to hear about what you think of as all the stuff that you were doing and still do.
Goodness. I guess first off, I really don't think I did a lot um, compared to a lot of others. Um, but let's see. First, I was on America Online. For the kids out there, that's an internet service. How we got onto the internet in those days, kind of a walled garden thing that you would log into with your modem and connect to the internet and find like-minded people. And some of the first stuff I ended up doing to any large scale was there. I'd done a few things here, locally before then, but and it was around getting America Online to allow transgender discussions on the service. At the time, they were not allowing certain words to be said on the service. If you had chat groups that you had set up that were using the word transvestite or transsexual, this was really before transgender was on the radar. We were already using that in the community, but it wasn't an established term. And it even had, at that time, alternate meanings to how we use it in parlance today. It was largely referring to someone who had transitioned publicly, but was not intending to go and have any medical intervention. But if you use these terms in the name of a chat or a cross-dresser, they would shunt your chat to a private chat, remove it from a public space on the service. You could have your account suspended or removed entirely for repeated infractions. They just simply were not allowing it. And a small number of us formed a group called the America Online Gender Group, AOLGG, and we started contacting them via email, via snail mail. We had people show up at their offices in Virginia to talk with them about it. We did a lot of phone calls. I mean, this was very primitive back in the day, even though we had email at the time, because obviously we all had our AOL.com emails, which I still have mine, by the way.
Wow.
Oddly enough,
I had
even
mine
though,
through my job at the time, so mine went away
yeah,
when I quit that job.
because I ended up, spoiler warning, because I ended up as an information provider on America Online, I ended up having the email address much longer, and it actually still works, and I have no idea how. So great,
And you can
the
still access it?
I can still access it,
That's
which is the
wild.
strangest thing. Um, anyway, um, we eventually were able to get America Online to change their policies around trans discussions, around words that were allowed. This was after some months of us kind of skirting the edges of the service and having chat groups where we'd toss names like Friend of Virginia on the name of the group, or things like this to try to evade being kicked private. Um, and the thing is, at the time, and one of the arguments that we were very clear on was that there was nothing in our chats that was explicit. Not that I cared one way or another, but we were generally like checking in at the end of the day and having, chit chat amongst friends. And yet we're still being kicked private simply because we named the site trans and we were trans people and allies of trans in that chat. Um, like I said, they eventually relented. Next thing I got involved with after that, there was an information provider on Second Life, and to clarify, an information provider or IP in Second Life in America Online parlance. Boy, that was a spoiler warning for where I'm working today. But an IP in America Online was someone that provided information. They hosted a forum. They had an arrangement, a contract with America Online to provide a space. There was, different magazines or different focus groups would be IPs. And the one that was gay and lesbian specific, the GLCF, Gay Lesbian Community Forum, reached out to myself and also to Melanie Ann Phillips, who was doing a Sunday night gender chat on the GLCF, and asked if we wanted to do more there. I absolutely did. I wanted a trans forum. We pressed for that. We ended up having a dedicated space called the Transgender Community Forum, which was the first public trans place on the internet. There
And so to
were,
back up, what year is
yeah,
this?
this is 1995. There were, prior to that, there were BBS services that were privately owned. There was HSX 200 on CompuServe, which was a competitor to America Online that had a private closed HSX was human sexuality. They had a private closed area that you had to apply to join. We were the first public out there. Look, here we are. Anyone can access us. Anyone who had an AOL account could come in to the TCF into our chat room, which was the gazebo, and meet with us, talk with us, get the resources that we were sharing. As that grew, we started to add extra spaces. It's important to kind of, I guess, not necessarily back up, but to note that this was prior to the World Wide Web kind of becoming a thing. It still existed very much in its infancy at this point. It really hadn't caught on. So what we were doing then was providing kind of subspaces in the TCF for, say, transsexual minutes. We set up a little forum for them. ICLEP, the International Conference of Transgender Law and Employment Policy, run by Phyllis Fry. We set up a space for them. It's Time America, which was another early activist group. We set up a space for them. We set up a space for Aegis under Dallas Denny, so that they could share their resources to our audience, and our audience can be informed of what they're up to. After in 1997, I want to think it was, the GLCF started to transition, haha, to on cue. And we started this change because America Online, well, a couple of things had happened. First off, America Online changed from their pay us every hour to be on the service to allowing anyone to be in for free. At the time, information providers on the service were being paid by America Online by the hour as well. So if we had people using our part of their service, we got X amount of dollars.
Hmm.
Um,
I didn't
I
know
didn't
that's how
get
it worked.
those. Yeah, I didn't get those myself, at least not at first. Those went to Michelle Quirk, who ran the GLCF. Eventually, I did become an employee of hers when we made this change to OnQ. The other reason for that change was that America Online started to invest in a secondary gay and lesbian forum called Planet Out on their service,
Okay.
and started to kind of copy everything we were doing. So we went ahead and rebranded to try to be more hip and fresh than GLCF, so that we could attract the advertisers that Planet Out was now getting, and try to stay alive. That allowed me to then become part of our business, and I started to run a bit more there. That didn't go as well as it probably could have. We ended up being cut from America Online in '99, I want to say. At that point, there were a lot of other irons in my fire, so it wasn't necessarily that bad. But we were cut from there. We had eventually sold. We bought, I think, gay.net, and then gay.com bought us, and then eventually Planet Out bought us as well. And that pretty much spelled the end of Transgender Community Forum. However, in the course of that time, the web had started to become a thing. I learned HTML. This was back before there were services that you could generate HTML with. There was no Wix or whatnot. There
Right.
weren't any apps that created it for you. It was all very much a hand-coded world.
Yeah, I had to learn some, I mean, I would argue light HTML for my
Yeah,
blog. Like WordPress existed, but nothing was what you see is what you get yet. Like I had to
right.
italicize, like, and I had Rachel in the house. I'd go like, how do I do the thing? But yeah, I had like
Bracket I end bracket.
short, yeah, like the bracket,
Yeah,
A,
caret.
href, all that stuff. Yeah, but
Right.
I learned the basics, but not much more.
Yeah. So I started to do web pages, did my own, then started to work with some of the other, because I could do it. I did work for Dallas for ages. I did stuff for Transsexual News Telegraph, which was a San Francisco based zine that Jill Inquist was putting out. I did their site. I did work for FTM International, a couple of other places. The biggest of the ones I did for others was probably Lauren Cameron's.
Mm-hmm.
Lauren was a trans man who passed away not too long ago.
Yeah, it's
Um,
recent.
yeah, he was a photographer, did some incredible photography of trans men. Eventually did a project that focused on the options and variations for trans men's lower surgeries. Um, Put out a book
Yeah, I
called
mean, I,
Body
I wasn't
Alchemy.
involved in trans stuff at all, and I remember when Body Alchemy came out
Yeah,
because
Body Alchemy
it
was
was such a
big.
big deal in terms of, yeah,
Yeah,
nothing like that
and
had ever been made. So yeah.
yeah, and gorgeous photography, amazing photography. I had actually first heard of Lauren in '93 or '4. Whenever his first big show that was in Santa Monica, California at Horizons, because Kate was also doing a play there, and
Um,
Kate invited me down for that, and so I saw his "Our Bodies, Our Voices" display, and I was just blown away by the images. because it was really kind of the first time that I was aware of, certainly, that you saw large, beautifully done portraits of transgender people um, being unapologetically trans.
Yeah.
The show had not just him, but had a couple of other people that he photographed. And it was just really astounding to see that at that time. Um, we ended up becoming fairly good friends. I did a couple projects for him. He shot me a couple of times, um, you know, and I did his website, and that became a big deal because the website was also showing his work and eventually included an ebook called Mantool, which was all of the surgery stuff. Um, then, of course, also somewhere in there, I did the Remembering Our Dead project. And that actually was born out of uh, being again on AOL and the Transgender Community Forum in the gazebo one night. And this was November of 1998. And Rita Hester had just been murdered. And I was talking with people in the chat room that night. And I said, hey, thinking about this is very similar to the Chanel Pickett murder that just happened 3 years before. And, they're both African American. It was both November, one's November 20th, the other's November 28th. They're both in Boston suburbs. They both had gone to the club and were killed overnight. I wasn't making an inference that there was any connection between the cases, but it still was surprising to me how similar the cases were. And so I was bringing that up in the chat room, and I was surprised that the response to it was essentially, well, who's Chanel Pickett? What's this? I've never heard about this, even for people that were in the Boston area who were in the chat. And
But they
it
had
really
heard about
shocked
Rita.
me. They hadn't heard about Chanel.
Right.
They hadn't heard about Rita, but they also hadn't heard about Chanel.
Sure.
And the reason that surprised me at that time was that Chanel had been killed 3 years before, but the trial for her murder wrapped up 15 months before. It was local news, fairly large local news. Nancy Nangeroni, who's a trans activist in the Boston area, had made a lot of fuss about the case and had been quoted extensively everywhere. And it was just completely, in 15 months, became unknown. It was completely forgotten. And it just really struck me. It was like, wait, we completely have no knowledge of what's going on out here, of just, where our dangers lie. And that led me to start researching it and putting together a web project to honor those who we'd lost through anti-transgender violence. I put out the first site late in '98. I rushed very quickly to get it up. And it had about 30 names on it at that point. And it very quickly grew into hundreds of names.
How did you hear, say for the first 30? I mean,
the first 30.
You've got Nancy being an activist in Boston. That's where
right.
people hear about Rita.
Yeah. There were.
Yeah, where did the information come from? I mean, so often to this day, right? Trans people are misgendered in the police reports, etc. So finding people had to be challenging.
The first 30 was basically everything that I could find on the internet through trans sites, through word of mouth from other trans people, through Nancy Nangeroni, in fact, was a person, because I believe she clued me into the Deborah Forte murder, which also had happened in the Boston area, which I eventually became friends with one of the members of the family there, who's another potential person to interview, which is Ethan St. Pierre.
Yeah, he's on my list.
Good. it all ties together. The fun thing about this point in the internet was that everyone knew each other. Um,
Honestly, I feel like that was true even when we showed up. That I had
no doubt, no doubt.
someone was telling me the story that it was like the Youngs are like, well, you guys just talk to each other, and I'm like, look, there were like 20 people when we showed up, so
Right,
more than that, but it always felt like it was like 20 people, and depending on who was
right.
doing the conference stuff and who had a blog and who was on which websites. Like I just found out, this is a funny story, but Vanessa Foster just sent me a link that was published on TG Forum, and I was like, how does that still exist? That feels like
Yeah,
hundreds of years ago, but it was Dallas's piece about
right.
the upcoming trans week in
Yeah.
Provincetown. But it's like, wow,
I
who
won't
knew
talk.
TG Forum was still out there? I had no
Yeah,
idea.
I won't talk about some of the stuff on the computer over here because I've got some stuff.
No doubt.
um, but the first 30 were that was pretty much the way it went. After that, um, Susan Stryker
Right.
gave me access to the stacks at the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society, now the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. So I was digging through every magazine that I could get a hold of, every source that they had in the back room, in the stacks, everything from older FTM International to, I mean, back to Drag Magazine from the late 60s, early 70s to find source. I mean, for the longest time, the earliest case I had was actually from one of the first issues of Drag Magazine.
Wow.
Um, it started that way. Eventually, I was also going to the San Francisco Public Library and digging through all of their microfilm and microfiche, trying to find information. I had a LexisNexis account, which was an online database for for finding material, and I would go through that. I would search any number of terms. I learned all very horrible terms that they would put, whether it was man dressed as woman to
Mhm.
try to find information, or bearded woman was one that came up in a lot of FTM cases,
Sure.
early FTM cases. Because once you find the resource, then you start to track down more information. You try to find secondary source. You try to find any information about the case. And as I would put them up on the site, oftentimes people who knew this or that person would come to me with more information, which helped immensely to be able to establish the stories of these people. Um, that's really kind of, I want to say, not just the first 30, but probably the first 100, 200 names.
So, and you heard directly from friends of the person. I assume that in most cases, families were not necessarily involved, but it was
Yeah,
friends
some of the
within.
times, mostly friends in the community. There were a couple of times where it was family, and those could often be very difficult because in many cases they wanted to remember someone under another name, under another gender, and could be very upset, in fact, to see their loved one be shown as trans on the site.
And that certainly changed over time. But just like the reality is, I've still had quite a few friends who, at the time would have called themselves cross dressers, but who were buried obituary appears in their legal name, and basically out of respect, people don't connect them. Like they had in some
Right,
cases, a very significant online presence, but who they actually were legally is separate. And there's only a couple of cases at this point, even that I know, of people who I'm like, I really wish I could make that connection, but
right,
you don't do that if the person didn't do it in their life, then you don't do it after their death. So
right. There was and this is a fairly, this is back in TCF days, actually pre-TCF days, to be quite frank. There was one of our regulars who hung out in the chats, Laura and Diana Wilson, and she actually is. I still to this day, whenever I have like an email sig line, it's going to be her quote that's in there. She was a trans woman living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, working working in steel of all places, all things. Who would have thought in Pennsylvania? She did take her life, unfortunately. Her family, however, had claimed the body and had a funeral that was non-publicized. She was put in an unmarked grave. She was buried in not only male clothes, but also with Catholic vestments on the body, because they wanted to make sure that they would go into heaven or whatever. Lauren was Wiccan high priestess, just to add insult to that entry. She was a very dear friend of mine. The Transgender Community Forum was dedicated in her honor. I still think about her fairly often.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I was just explaining to someone, that one of the reasons that Rachel and I took advantage of our heterosexual loophole at the time was precisely because her family is religious in a way. And like we had a friend who just ended up in like an ER, and I just thought, my God, if that happens and we're not married, they're going to be able to do that. And
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
as much as, that's always been complicated for us because on paper, right at the time, on paper, we were straight, which is funny to think about now. But it was
I
still,
guess.
it was a very real issue. And I've had a couple of
Yeah.
friends who've done the research on sort of what legal paperwork people can provide. But you think, especially for anyone who doesn't have another relative, right? It's going to be parents necessarily who swoop in. But
Mhm.
even if you do, right, it can be complicated depending on the state laws, depending on what markers you've legally had changed or not, depending on the ER, the hospital, like all of these variations. And I think sometimes when I try to express to cis people who are doing activism, like you don't really understand how complicated it is to go. I don't even, Rachel and I should still have a bunch of legal paperwork filled out that we don't. Like our marriage
Right.
doesn't even necessarily do that, and we're pretty institutionalized, for lack of a better word,
Right.
not in the complicated mental health way, but in the fact that we have documents and name change, and I have the paper trail and all of that stuff. But we spent years too, like where Rachel didn't change like one legal document, so just in case, right? I had the gender marker on something. We name change doesn't matter, but the gender
Right.
marker stuff we didn't, just so it was like, I don't want to end up in, we're going to visit her family in North Carolina. Like I used to carry 18 pieces of paperwork, just in
Right.
case I want to be able to be at the,
That's. I
people
mean.
don't realize the anxiety of all of this, I
Yeah.
think, for people in
Yeah.
general. But
I absolutely get that. I mean, my partner and we wed prior to my transition. Not by very long, um, but
so good.
yeah, I've definitely had to, play very cautious with all my paperwork. It was a concern here in California with Prop 8 and Prop 22 prior to that. Kind of putting us in that legal limbo of, well, we're married. The paperwork says M, so therefore it's legal, but it just becomes very squidgy. And in fact, I've only recently, earlier this year, finally gotten my birth certificate,
I did see that. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and my marriage certificate should be coming in about a week and a half.
Wow. We never
Theoretically.
redid ours. I suppose I could get that changed now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like anyone ever asks for it anymore, but
Right.
I don't know. I gotta think about
It's
that.
one of those.
I'll have to ask Rachel if she wants to do that. So
Yeah. It's at the point where it's the last stone in the gauntlet, if you will.
Sure,
So
sure.
it's like let's finish it all out. Let's
Nerdy
take care
nerdy
of all of
reference
this.
alert for everybody. But yeah, that was a Marvel's
Yes,
reference, but
yes,
Avengers reference specifically. But yeah,
right.
it's and we've thought about it's funny because it hasn't come up. I've known a lot more couples who come from who were at the time identified as queer women who got married, who for whom
Mhm.
like changing the marriage certificate mattered more. Again, ours does not come up.
Right,
I mean, we did move at some point from New York, which was certainly more progressive, even though frankly the
right,
same-sex legal rights weren't in place, but we moved to a super DOMA state. So
right,
for those playing along, DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, and super DOMA places where same-sex couples not only couldn't get married, but they couldn't have anything resembling marriage. And Wisconsin was
right,
one of those states. So I mean, we were lucky we got hired by a private university. So they,
right,
I mean, they legally had to anyway. We were legally heterosexual married. So
right.
remember, I've had to do that with like bank account openings. It's like the sheer number of people, I guess, who were not prepared for a trans queer couple. And
Right.
this year, I would just say, Rach, stay home. I got it. Like, you don't need to deal with this. So I'll go explain the deal with the accountants and I'll show them. Like, literally would bring books like, here's this essay about this thing so you could read what tort is,
Yeah.
contract law means this, and that. So, so much
Yeah.
to negotiate, though.
I was cleaning out an old purse not too long ago, and like finding a crumpled up copy of my carry letter, which, for those not aware, a letter that indicated that no, I have legally changed my name, blah blah blah. I'm identifying in this particular gender, just so that there
I
was
haven't heard
some
that
sort of,
term in so long. Carry letter.
yeah, just so that there was a notarized thing way back when that you could say, no, really. Prior to 9/11 in California, you could change your name and gender in this state with a carry letter. So
It's
not
only
anymore,
post Patriot
obviously.
Act. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I totally get the drama of paperwork and all that that entails.
Well, it's
Oh, and
it's
then another,
interesting to me only because I don't think straight cis people understand how much of that is involved and different versions of it as well. Like
mhm,
when you're talking to lesbian couples, was just thinking about the story where this straight dude was talking to this lesbian couple who just had kids, and he was like, "Oh, how'd you do?" I was like, "Dude," he was like, "Oh, I feel like we get pregnant every time we turn around." I was like, "Wow, could you be more insensitive?" But then you
yeah,
realize people just don't understand and don't know that it is far more complicated to do everything.
oh yeah,
If you're LGBTQ, even
yeah.
even
I
with
mean, you
Obergefell, even with everything, it's still anxiety. I mean,
right,
every time there's an election, I feel like we're all going, okay, are we going to lose everything or
right.
no?
Especially this one, where I mean, everybody is holding their breath, absolutely holding their breath right now.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I'm just getting my passport renewed because I it's a little early,
yeah,
but I'm like better now. So
I say with the previous election, I was scrambling even up to the last minute, past January 20th, trying to make sure that I had my passport just in case, just to have something at that level. Um, because who knows? Um, and it's funny to talk about, well, funny, darkly funny. Um, people think that trans people just up and decide to transition one day to be able to use a different restroom or go play a different sport or whatever. And it's like, you have no idea how much is involved in this. This is not that simple. This is in no way that simple.
well, and I think also the understanding. I mean, Rachel for years had a job and lived in New York City where she didn't bother to change her IDs because she already had an established position. And what really brought up, oh, I think it's time to maybe do some paperwork, was that she was looking for a job. And I was like, you can't
Mhm.
put that name on there. Like,
Yeah,
you've been I mean, at the time she was working as, but like everyone knew her as Betty. It was like everybody did. And there were people, her family, people who still dead named her. We were a little bit more complicated in that realm. It was also before the term dead name was a thing. So it was
right.
just her previous name. But this notion that, like, that people are just rushing out to get stuff changed. It was like we put it off for as long as she could because it was like, oh, this is going to be a pain.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do when you know you can't get your birth certificate changed because you're born in the state that won't do that? Your driver's license, you can maybe get changed depending on this. It's like all of this and having mismatched documents and the anxiety that that causes people. Um, yeah, no, I don't think that's a thing. Yeah, the idea that people are just rushing out, especially to play sports, never mind. Yeah,
Yeah, it doesn't I mean, well, we know this just doesn't make sense.
yeah,
Um,
no, it does
I
not.
was going to also add, because we're talking about things I've been involved in. Um, it was 2000 now, so 24 years, good Lord, that I started writing the transmissions column,
Right.
which is a biweekly transgender issues column in the Bay Area Reporter. It also gets republished in Philadelphia Gay News and sometimes in Between the Lines in Michigan.
Hmm.
It used to be in a few others, but print,
Yeah,
print media.
print media has
Uh,
basically gone away. So,
right. But I've started doing that way back then as well, and served
that was in
on several
2000.
boards, and yeah,
I
you know,
mean,
I
was that
served
that
on.
was that was actually a regular article that appeared,
Yeah, it still is.
syndicated
Still is.
or
Yep,
semi, yeah.
semi.
I don't,
Um,
it's so funny because I don't even know what qualifies something as syndicated or not. I assume as long as it gets
yeah,
picked up by a couple of other papers, it's syndicated.
right, right.
Yeah.
But it's definitely housed out of the BAR in San Francisco. I've worked with Cynthia Laird over there, who's the editor for 24 years. She still expects me to get my articles in. I'll be writing mine tonight. Uh,
Awesome. Hey, feel free to write
um,
about this interview if you'd like. I know
I might. I might.
content creation is a thing.
I'm actually, this one's going to be about the DNC
Oh,
and some of the things that the Republicans are saying, like Trump's thing yesterday about how kids can go off to school and they end up getting an operation and 15 years they regret it. And it's this whole weird word salad, but you kind of see where it's coming from and it's like not coming from a good place.
well,
Um,
isn't there some case right now in the news where somebody did detransition and they now won't let the detransition person change their name back to their legal name? There's some story I saw like in a
there's something
second.
about
I'll see
that.
if I can
Yeah.
send it to you. But I think that's
Yeah.
why they're currently making noise is that this case hit the news somewhere. So
Right.
I don't know. I try to avoid the word salady rants of that
Same.
asshole. I'm just
It's,
gonna go with that
it's,
asshole because
yeah.
I
It's
won't even
always
use his
fun
name.
to,
I still refuse.
yeah.
I feel like, and I
It's,
always apologize to everybody for. I am so sorry the city of New York did not take care of that problem for everybody before it became a national issue. But
yeah, seriously. I
like we knew
remember
he
him
was an
from the
asshole. We didn't know he
80s.
was this much of an asshole. But yeah.
Yeah. I remember first hearing about him in the 80s. So, you know, and pretty much deciding then, who's this jerk?
Well, we used
Um,
to just call him. He was like another douche bro with bottle service, right? I mean that.
yeah.
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 There's a lot of those in New York, so we didn't. Yeah, I think
Fair.
underestimated. Also, I don't think New York ever took him very seriously, frankly. But you know, um,
These
sadly, we
things
all have
happen.
to now. Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of the what's the term I want? Occupational hazards of writing a news column is that you do have to like see what he's saying, or there's two people that I have pretty much I try to never write about, but they keep making it very difficult, which is
Who's the other one?
well,
The
no, it's not Trump of all things. It's
oh
Caitlyn Jenner
sure,
and J.K. Rowling,
yeah, well,
and the
yeah,
reason is that
she's been kind of quiet, so that's sort of nice.
yeah, and the reason is that they want you to write about them. They want that publicity. And it's like, so I try not to give it to them. Although I had to break that rule last week because I was writing about Imani Khalif
Hmm.
and the Olympics, and
Sure.
Rowling made plenty of noise about that. So I needed to kind of extract that
Yes,
story.
I love the idea that she kind of deserves another gold medal for getting Raleigh to shut
She
up for a
absolutely
hot minute.
does.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Well,
13 days.
we should just figure out like a trans medallion or something that's like,
We
thank
should.
you for your service. I mean, it's interesting. I was just talking to Julia Serrano about this because
Mhm.
um, the notion of like, first of all, they always know, right? Which they don't. But as someone who like, I mean, I had a revelation of a moment at some point talking to Rachel. I don't remember when this was, but it hadn't even occurred to me. So for years, since I was like 14, I would get misgendered. When I was especially punk rock, whatever version of that, shaved head, combat boots kind of thing.
Right.
I did not identify as queer. I was just a punk rock kid. And but really didn't think about my gender or really didn't particularly like being a girl. Let's go with that.
Fair.
And so at some, this would happen regularly. And I had forgotten that I did it, but like years and years before, I'd made a photocopy of my birth certificate that I folded and shoved in, my Filofax or whatever I was carrying around, notebook or whatever. And I always had a copy of it with me. And at some point, this is, years later, I'm in my late 20s, early 30s. Rachel was like, why do you carry a copy of your birth certificate everywhere? And I just went, because of my gender. And she just said, really? Like, really? Are we really doing this? And I was like, I'd forgotten I did it. It was like where I was literally like cleaning out a bag to put something in
Yeah.
the other bag. And she was like, why is there a copy of your birth certificate in here? And I was like, well, I always carry that just in case someone gets my gender wrong. And she just, I'm going to say she laughed for a full 20 minutes. And I was like, she was like, oh, so you meant to marry me? And I was like, not really, not really. That was all. I thought I was done thinking about gender. I had my birth certificate and my philo, and it was all going to be fine. But yeah, I got misgendered a lot. And so the whole idea of going, we can tell who's trans, you
Well, it's
know,
like one of the things that often comes
now
up
you
in
can't.
social media with that is, when you come across someone who does we can always tell, there's some people that will throw them a picture of J.K. Rowling and say, well, you're going to tell me that this is a man? Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, yeah, it's
I
J.K.
remember noticing
Rowling.
that having arguments with turfs back in the day and just going, look, I've
Yeah,
seen your photo, man. Like, do you really think you clock as I don't know what they are trying to define women as, like
yeah,
a nice Christian lady? I don't even know what we're going for anymore,
right.
what that group is, because I try to not pay attention to them either. But
They're
it really
going
is,
for, they're going for any gotcha they can get. Let's
yeah,
face it.
I know,
You
but
know,
I mean, this should be, I mean, I think in every conversation I've ever had when I've talked to, especially lesbian, queer women, mask leaning women, tomboys, whatever version of that we
mhm,
want to use, I've always been kind of astonished because I'm like, because that whole line comes up of like, well, I didn't have to transition. I could just be gender non-conforming, or I could just be queer. I could just be a butch. And it was like, okay, well, that's nice for your gender, but that doesn't mean you understand how trans people are experiencing. Like, it always
right.
blew my mind that people go, okay, well, this is my experience of gender, so therefore transness doesn't exist. And I was like, look, I'm in the same universe, but I can understand. Like, I had a conversation with some trans people, and I understand that my experience of gender is complicated, culturally loaded, a whole bunch of other things. It's not my wife's, right?
Right.
There's a
I
her
grew
need to
up,
transition and my need not to transition
yeah,
are private experiences.
I grew up in the East End of East LA
Sure.
in a city called South El Monte, and it's a largely Hispanic neighborhood. As a result, growing up a lot of my formative years, I picked up a lot of things from the neighborhood as far as speaking a little Spanish, understanding a lot of the Spanish culture, a lot of what was going on there. That doesn't mean I'm Spanish.
Exactly.
It
Yes.
doesn't mean that I have an ingrown understanding of the culture and the identity. I have a very surface understanding of it. I can understand it probably better than someone from an area that has no Hispanic individuals living in it, but it's still a surface understanding. It's not the lived experience in much the same way.
And and I would argue too that that kind of knowledge is good. I think we should all know more
Yeah,
about each
sure.
other's cultures and experiences. You just can't decide what it's like to be Latina in America if you're not.
Right.
That's,
Right.
you know. So like if you're not trans, you don't identify as trans, maybe you don't get to say anything about that.
Right.
Um, yeah, it's always interesting to me because it's like just the revelation when I'm talking to cis people that I'm like, you have a gender too, and you mind when someone might use the wrong pronouns. And of course, there's so many cis people who like that never happens to. But I was like, when you find the people who it has, like I remember the smartest boy in my third grade class and me, the smartest girl, we got misgendered all the time, both of us, by substitutes and whatever. And it was just, I ended up talking to him about that not long ago. It was like, it was a thing that kept happening. And it's like, I don't know, we had the same haircut. Who knows why? Um, but yeah, I mean, there's always people. But
It
I
was
think
it was
the more we look at what's going on with certainly pro-choice issues and abortion, like maybe autonomy is just a thing that everybody should have. Just
exactly. I mean, and related to that, back in the OnQ offices back in
mm,
San Francisco, way back in the day. Um, I was in the office one day, and our head of tech was on a phone call with a vendor. And after the phone call, she complained about how many times she was misgendered in that call. Um, she was very, she would identify as Butch at the time. Um, and I don't believe that she was trans, but I've not been in touch with her for many years, so I don't know what she's doing.
right.
Um, but she was very frustrated with the fact that she got misgendered all the time on the phone because she spoke with a very direct, she's dealing with a vendor. And it really kind of opened my eyes to that of, no, we all deal with this stuff, not just trans me, but everybody has to deal with this from people.
Yeah. And the gender expression arguably in the queer community is slightly more expanded, but I was always amazed when I would meet couples. There's always that couple you meet that everyone's like, I think they're both gay, and I'm like, maybe they're not. Maybe it's just their genders. Like maybe they're two straight people whose genders just work together, and the dude might be soft as posies and the lady's hard as nails, and it's like that's what works in their like. Do we have
Yeah,
to talk about everybody's anyway? Like if they both either do need to come out at some point, I'm sure they know where we are. So, or they're just, gendery straight people. It's fine.
right.
Yeah. Um, okay. I have so many more questions to ask you, and I feel like we're like zooming through time. Um,
Hence why we're on Zoom.
I know it's oh God, you noticed I didn't. I didn't.
You
So
did.
one of this you mentioned Lauren Diane Wilson, and you've
Hmm.
mentioned Phyllis Fry and Melanie Ann Phillips and Lauren Cameron. Um, I guess Phyllis, sorry, is also still alive.
Yep.
Is there anyone else you're thinking of who was involved in early trans movement? I think one of the things, especially considering your um, Remembering Our Dead project, like I think there's a lot of people we've lost who are being forgotten by history. And
Right.
one of the things I would like to do is make sure that as I do this project, that we create some of these lists. So I've been asking everybody, like, who are the people? Are there people who kind of helped you start things or that you worked with on projects who, not necessarily even, died of old age, but
No.
whose contributions to trans movement should be remembered in some way
Well,
or known.
yeah, the first one that comes off top of my head is Penny, Penni, Ash, Ashe, Matz, Matz. And Penny was another Boston area trans activist. She operated the Gain News List. She was part of gender.org with me. And prior to that, part of its Time America.
Mhm.
Um, she also is someone who I consider the co-founder of Transgender Day of Remembrance because it was after the TG Rage event in San Francisco, which was the kind of sort of proto TDOR, but not really.
Mhm.
It's where we got kind of the idea, the ball rolling from. Penny and I sat down virtually on the phone and talked about the event, and that it really worked, it really brought attention, and that we should turn that into something. That's what led to the TDR event. And Penny, she passed away unfortunately many years ago now, is largely forgotten in the movement, um, and deserves more attention. Um, she worked with Jessica Xavier a lot, and Nancy Androni knew her. Jessica Xavier is another one I don't hear much of anymore. Jesse was very involved with ITA and with early activism stuff. Um, Margot Schaefer is another one that doesn't come up that often.
Yes,
So,
I have to say I'm almost scared to ask Susan this question because I know she's going to give me a very, very long list. But
oh, I can go on and on. Trust me.
and it's really, I mean, it's really I decided to call this project Shoulders of Giants to some degree because I was going to use it was elder to us, at least in terms of movement, but um it's really just so profound to me that I mean, in hearing all of the stories that I've been told, even Kate's about Phil Donahue, right, who recently
Mhm.
passed, and sort of what a mensch he was to her when she was on the show, which,
Yeah.
doing TV is always complicated for still complicated for trans people to be on shows like that, but that he provided some kind of safety or belief in her at
Man,
the time.
she got Phil Donahue. I got Bill O'Reilly. I got Jennifer.
Yeah.
I want, you know.
We were on Keith Ablow's show, like it was before he was an asshole,
Mhm.
but it's still embarrassing. Anyway,
Yeah.
I mean, he wasn't yet an asshole. He had not become this weird right wing thing, but it was anyway.
Thing.
Yeah, he was gonna dehumanize people, but I mean, his show
Yeah.
hadn't become that kind of hateful. It was more like he was trying to find his market, and then he just went weird.
Yeah.
But as a result, we're like, let's not talk about that anymore. But the reality is, I mean, seeing especially now, like something like Disclosure come out and having people talk about those parts, and having their voice changed, or all of the stuff that when you were trying to, I mean, this I think conversation comes up in a lot of marginalized communities. Like, at what point does any representation become worse or better? Like, how do we change what the dynamic looks like? And I always used to say we only did stuff because I hope people would actually buy the books and read them, and get actual
Right.
information and not just an hour of shitty television. So
Right.
I think when you were trying to go, okay, no, there's more information, and also reaching the trans people who weren't out. Like, I mean, one of the
Right.
reasons we did what we did was we don't see relationships much. Arguably, I don't think we still do, but
Yeah.
20 years later, I'm still complaining about that. But
No, I
um,
get it. My partner and I locally during the Prop, I think it was during Prop 22, although it came up again under Prop 8. We had you know, two anti-marriage amendments. It was so nice they did it twice. Um, and we were talking to some of the LGBT orgs in the area, and they didn't want our story. They felt that it muddied the story, that it would cause too much confusion. We ended up going directly to some of the local press, and getting our story out there just to say, hey, look, this is affecting us too,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and just showing, look, we're a couple out here. I transitioned, and how does this affect us?
It was amazing. There was one night that Rachel and I were out and dressed for something at a queer event, and someone actually said, "So you're straight?" And I'm like, "I'm in a suit, and she's in a get. Like, come on, could we look more like a dressed up queer couple? Never mind, But it's really always working with like sort of a certain generation, arguably, of gay and lesbian who
Mm-hmm.
still don't really get it.
Yeah.
That's still out there, I think. Um,
Yeah. I
sadly.
mean, there's still, I mean, even after all these years of educating, there's still education to be done. And the more that the right wing pushes back, the more needs to be undone that they're teaching people. I was reading a person today that was, going on about, well, this new generation of trans activists has just really set us all back. And it's just like, no, no,
That's funny. That's
no.
actually one of my questions. Is like, so what do you think of the contemporary movement of trans activism? But
I am really excited by them. Um, there are things that are being done in trans activism today that when I started out were thought of as impossible. I dearly love seeing some of what's going on today out there. Um,
yeah,
their experiences, you know, their upbringings, their movement through the community is very different from mine. When I was coming out, it was an entirely different world. And I'm so jazzed to see that some of the groundwork that we laid back then has helped. And sometimes they don't have to do some of the stupid crap we had to do to be out in public, to be able to get care. You know, Planned Parenthood out here, which I also take advantage of, is informed consent. And for God's sakes, back in the mid 90s, informed consent, nobody was talking about that. No, here's an MMPI for you to fill out. Now go talk to a second therapist. Maybe we'll let you have some pills then.
I know. I forget who I was talking about. The whole real life test back in the day. I
Yeah,
was like, what a
yeah,
cruel practice that had to be. Like
yeah.
before you could even get hormones, to have to live in your gender for a year without. I mean, that doesn't mean that plenty of people manage to do it, but God, what a wild
It's a
and
pain in the
so
ass.
that's one of the reasons I'm doing this series is that
Hmm.
like the idea that at some point in time the victory was that you could go use a bathroom that was 2 floors away from your job because it was next to the janitor's closet or whatever, like, but you
Yeah,
could use the bathroom and not get fired for transitioning was a victory. And now,
right.
of course, you want to see people go, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that
The
we're saying
the
that's ridiculous, but I also want to see that having been a victory recognized, I guess, a little bit too.
right.
That
I mean, and that is, I mean, the real life test and all of that was a improvement
yeah,
at the time,
yeah,
because I didn't have to go to Stanford University and go talk with them down there and have to go through whatever they were going to put me through, or I think of, up in Toronto with the Fallometer and all that stuff, which is just so god awful to think of,
yeah,
you know. So when I came around in the mid 90s, yeah, we had incredible improvements over that. We were having better options for medical care and surgery than what they had prior to my generation.
yeah,
Um, it really wasn't that far before me that a lot of folks in Southern California, where I was, were going to Dr. Brown in Tijuana, who was an absolute butcher,
yeah,
but it's what people could get. Now it's a whole nother world, but it's a march of progress.
yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to see now when I'm talking to a young person, like every once in a while, someone will be like, well, I have a doctor's appointment and I don't want to miss it, like they're trying to miss a class. And it's
Hmm.
like, oh, congratulations. Like okay, I got it,
Yeah,
but the notion that it's like now it's not a standard thing. And for that matter, people don't come to me to find some doctor to go to. It's like they find them on their own. And it's like, that's great. I joke that if I have to get involved in some trans issue on campus, something has gone wrong. It used to
right.
be just for everything. I had to do education. I had to go argue with someone in charge. I had to go, and I don't
Yeah.
have to do any of that anymore. So
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons that I got involved in doing stuff on America Online and eventually the web and other places was that our community only existed in these incredibly small pockets. And I was living in Southern California, which is a pretty good sized area. And yet you had this meeting you could go to over here, and this meeting you could go to over here. And that was it. And you would go meet. The one I went to was a I still to this day cringe over the name PPOC, Powder Puffs of Orange County, um, which was an
That was so cool.
offshoot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an offshoot of the Tri-S group
Um,
that existed in LA County, but they were a little bit more progressive than Tri-S because they did allow transsexuals in the door.
right.
Um, and they,
A lot of the groups did unofficially and didn't report
yeah,
it. Yeah, it's, God,
this
really.
was a little bit
Anyway,
more out there. And even then, you're meeting in the back room of the Holiday Inn once a month. And that was your entire involvement with community. You had a changing room so you could change on site, this kind of thing. And the whole attitude was, you don't want to be seen out in public with another trans person because, and frankly, it was dangerous. I'm not saying they weren't wrong about that, but there was very much an attitude of you don't associate, you stay very small. And I didn't see that as a way for us to become, um, to grow, to change, to evolve. Um, Now, granted, I also do deal with some of my own personal demons of, well, maybe that was the wrong way to go. I don't know. It's hard for me to say. Um, but we wouldn't have changed if we stayed back in those closets.
yeah.
We wouldn't be where we are today, for good or ill.
Yes, I mean the pushback at the present moment is horrific. And honestly, I don't think we're still talking about it. I know, run up to an election is always complicated when it comes to rights of the most marginalized, but um, yeah, no, it's amazing to think about. I mean, I remember those meetings too. I did them on the East Coast in New Jersey instead, but um, we had a couple of people who thought that we were like that I was a journalist who had convinced my gay friend to pose as a CD, was the terminology
Mm-hmm.
at the time. And you just go, no, it's just so few people brought partners with them that
Right,
we were suspect just because of that. And we were on the younger side too, which is always I think was always an
right.
issue, specifically in trans femme
Oh,
circles.
absolutely. I know that with mine, yeah, the same thing where um, the first meeting or first couple of meetings somewhere in there at PPOC. Yeah, first off, we were probably 20 years younger than anyone that was in the room.
Yeah,
Because I was in my late 20s, early 30s, somewhere in there.
us too. Yeah.
Um, and we're a young married couple. We've been married for, at that point, probably a year and a half or so. And everyone who was in there was very much of a different generation. So my partner comes in the room and it's like, oh, well, you'll want to go into the kitchen with everybody else, and it was
I'm
just
sure
like,
that went over just fine. Yeah.
oh, that was lead balloon. Yeah, that did not go over well. Because that's definitely not my partner.
Right.
Fawn is
But at the same time,
not
I
gonna
will
be
say
that.
I met some amazing women in the first groups. Like I moderated the first group for partners of trans people at the gay center in New York, and I had
Mhm.
to explain to them why it was important. So even in circles, and they were like, "Yeah, but why are you doing this? Because you're straight." And I'm like, "Okay, slow your roll again." Um, but it was also so uncommon for someone who was partnered to a trans woman. Like there were a lot of queer women who were dating trans masks and trans
Right.
men, FTMs as they were called at the time. Um, but I was so rare that I actually would occasionally have lesbians correct me when I referred to my partner as she, and they'd be like, "Well, you said your partner is trans," and I'd be like, "Yeah, she's trans," and they'd be like, "So you mean he? Like, are you getting this wrong?" And I'm like, "It's my
Mm.
partner, and I'm pretty sure I know first of all her pronouns, but
Right.
also she's a trans woman," and they'd be like, "Oh, I don't even know there were couples like you guys," and it's like, yeah, yeah, plenty, but
Hmm. Hmm.
plenty. Yeah, it's amazing.
We
I'm,
have
I'm so
navigated
glad at
that.
the passage of time. I'm
Yeah.
I'm glad that it's more the assumption, right, that trans
Right.
people gather. Just for starters, James told a very interesting story about the first FTM conference put together in California, and um, now, right there, there's all sorts of things all the time. So,
Right.
um, cool. Did you ever know? So, who is your this is the other thing is sort of I keep thinking Shoulders of Giants and their sort of lineage. Who is the person who you read? Like, what was the book that you found that you went, or the person that you met who kind of, or handed you the book or went, you should go online? Or is there a person you think of like that?
Um, Thinking. I would say the person who was kind of the, well, I mean, I mentioned Lauren, who was big for me. Um, but that book right there,
Ah, God, yeah.
this was,
What edition
you
is that?
know, first, second,
Yeah,
yeah, this was very early.
mine's in my
Um,
work office. So
yeah,
I have like a
um,
aughts edition. I think a 90s edition,
yeah.
but yeah.
This was, I mean, I knew Kate. She was Outlaw Gal at AOL.com. And she was, this was prior to the TCF. She was on the TS Lesbian board in women's space on GLCF.
Wow.
And we used to hang out there. And hey, she's talking at one point where she's got this book coming out, you
Wow.
know.
That's
So
awesome.
went in, to the local Barnes and Noble and picked up her book. Um, and then eventually had her sign it.
Yeah.
Um, but I'd say that was probably like the first kind of, I mean, there were other books I read before this, to be clear, but this was kind of the big catalyst for me.
It also puts so much together. I mean, there's the research and the yeah. So I do
Yeah,
think that still Gender Outlaw brings a lot together in one
yeah,
place. That
yeah,
was, I think, the first book that I read that I was reading other stuff about trans people in order to kind of understand my wife. And I think Gender Outlaw was
yeah.
the first thing I read that I was like, oh, this has a bunch of answers to my questions too, right, about gender.
Hmm.
So, I mean,
Yeah,
the movement now, like even I've had so many people just say, well, you should just identify as non-binary. And I'm like, okay, that's fine, sure. Except it still doesn't feel like my language, if that makes any sense. It's like
right.
I
It
I did
does.
started identifying as gender neutral when I was like 16, and it's like people are like, yeah, well, that's under the non-binary umbrella. And I'm like, right, okay, sure. Just still doesn't feel generationally. Um,
Right. I get that.
yeah. It's like I'm old. I like
Um,
my gender neutral. I
right.
still like tomboy. Sorry, I'm still gonna use that one. 'Cause
Yeah. Um,
I don't need turfs to own that shit. So
True. Um, I mean, I first heard about the very existence of trans people in this world when I was quite young.
mhm.
Um, I was, my parents and I would go out on car trips on the weekends. And one trip on the way home, I'm in the back seat of the 63 Dodge Dart. My parents are up front, and the AM radio has a call in show. And this individual called in. They were the mother of a trans person. And they were calling for advice. What do I do about my child? Nothing, let them live their life. But that was the first I'd heard that this was a possibility at all. And at the very same time, my parents were in the front seat talking about, oh, this must be so hard on that woman to have to deal with this. I don't think I could deal with this. And it's like, okay, well, that's great.
Yeah,
But, and I heard about, oh God, Renee Richards, in 76 and 77, Wendy Carlos, um, there were lots of stories I picked up over time. On top of it, my dad had a fine collection of um, uh, Playboy, Penthouse, etc. They would have things. I mean, that's where I read the Wendy Carlos interview back in the
sure.
day. Um, so I had a certain level of knowledge from that, and also then the added bonus of, oh, so this is something that just comes up in these magazines, or in my mom's tabloids. It's going to be, you know, shocking stories about trans lives, one way or the other, and it's like, this is great. This is um. So I fought with that for a whole long time.
Yeah.
But it was really, in college, Bon and I had gotten engaged. Um, and I had that belief that a lot of trans women and probably also some trans men have. Look, I've got everything I'm supposed to have, and this still isn't working.
Yep.
Um, and so I started to find books then in the Pasadena Public Library, most of which were very dry academic books. Um, I've ended up buying
At least,
copies of them just
I mean,
guys,
richer
but
doctors were at least sympathetic. Like I remember reading
right,
transvestites and transsexuals and going, well, this
yep,
is very dry, but it's not lacking compassion. So,
right. That was one of them. Um, and these kind of helped at least start me on my way, but those weren't really this is the person and the book that really kind of kicked it off for me. That
mm,
was definitely Kate's book.
that's awesome. Yeah, I think they used to have those old band charts, right? Where this band, these members went and formed this band. And I just think
Right.
Kate is such a big nexus.
Yeah, she's a Nexus being.
Yeah. And as is Lauren, as is, Jameson, arguably.
Right.
But it's yeah, I mean just the sheer like being on Phil Donahue in the 80s. It's like, wow. I think we are all very lucky to have her. I know she occasionally
Yeah.
the youngs get very upset with her, but again, this is why exactly why this series is why I wanted to do it is
Right.
precisely because people might give advice very much based on what generation of trans they grew up in. And I always said the thing that always blew my mind is that even knowing people and cross dressers, right, who were very like, oh, it's fine for her to transition, but I could never. Like there's still that deeply felt like even if you were aware of this was a thing, the ability of an individual to just go, it just that leap is so. I mean, now they make egg cracking jokes, right?
Right.
And it's like, okay, um, I'm glad we can joke about this stuff now because that
Yeah.
used to be so difficult when I'd be talking to someone and go, I'm not going to tell you, I hope you figure your way out. But
Yep.
now people are just like, well, I think you're an egg. Okay, that's yeah, good.
Hmm.
Maybe not. Maybe let's do this without years and years of angst
Right.
or different versions of angst, at least, perhaps. Okay, I'm just trying to look over my questions and make sure that there's not one single good one that I have forgotten. Do. Trans activism now. Okay, so just I think as an ending question, this is a good one. So you can order them, answer them in whichever order you'd like. But the two questions are, what are you most proud of, and what's like the thing that you didn't get right? So it's up to you to decide in what order you want to answer this.
Oh, those are good questions. Um, The things I'm most proud of are that I'm still here. Um, Anything that I've done that has benefited the community is great and well, but I have survived to this point, and that was nothing I had ever expected to see possible. I had, from my teenage years, expected to be gone by like age 30, 35, and I've almost doubled that. And that's pretty surprising to me. I've actually managed to transition, which was something that I never thought was possible. Um, so the things I'm proud of are fairly personal, um, because, on top of that, and I think this starts to get into question two, of that, is it's very hard for me to see really the impact of anything that I have done. Um, I did things, um, that's for sure. At the same time, I'm watching this horrible backlash we're going through and wondering, were the things I did the right thing? Were there things I could have done differently? Were there things I could have done better? One particular moment in my life that I go back to, um, and knowing rationally that this is not on my shoulders,
Mm.
um, is that I was in, I want to say 2015, but that doesn't sound right. But maybe it is. During the Obama years, I'll put it that way. I ended up, through NCTE. They got a hold of me one day. I get an email out of the blue from Mara Kiesling that says, something about going to DC, and I'm thinking, what, do they want money again? And it was actually a note from her saying, hey, some stuff fell through. We need someone to come talk to the administration on trans issues, TDOR related. So it's like, well, I guess I have plans later this week. Ended up going to DC. I was over in the Eisenhower building on the West Wing, talking with people from all of the different departments, um, and sharing kind of some of my story and TDOR's story. Um, and at the conclusion of that, everyone also was going around the room and talking about what their individual departments were working on. Health and Human Services had just done things that week, and so that was being discussed. So forth, went around the room. One of them was the Department of Education, and they were working on a pamphlet that they were going to be putting out that was essentially an anti-bullying pamphlet, but that discussed trans issues obliquely.
Mhm.
I think it had to do with restroom use and things like that. Um, and hey, that was great. And that was the starting point for the right wing to push back, was that pamphlet.
Oof. Oof.
That was some of the first kind of real organized pushback from the right wing was, look, they're going to allow boys to be in the restrooms. It says here in this book. And being in that room and thinking back on it, it's like, is there something I could have said, something I could have done at that moment? Um, I don't know. I don't think there was. I don't think that would have even been my place to say anything. But that's the sort of things that I second guess and wonder, could I have done more? There's where my regrets are.
Yeah, that's a heavy thought. I feel like I still look back and say there's certainly a lot of things I got wrong over the years, but um, I think too, yeah, I would just say too, they really were looking for another issue after Obergefell, and I think the
Yeah.
trans community got that, and the timing of it I still don't see that. Like I see this almost, at least during that period, as a natural like backlash is expected, right? I
Right.
did feminist work before, even working in trans community. It's always, that sometimes two steps forward, three steps back, what, as long as you're gaining. And
Right.
I must say I am overwhelmingly very convinced we are. I feel like I say this to students all the time, like just what has changed. Like I didn't expect to see same-sex marriage in my lifetime, frankly. And I do think that there has been tremendous success. So, um,
Yeah.
also, you're not responsible for somebody else's
No,
hateful bullshit. So,
no, no. Um, it's funny you mentioned it because I think back to um, it wasn't the reading that I first went to for that, but I went to a later. I think it was when Kate released. Yeah, it was when Kate and Caitlin did. Um, what was the name of that book?
I don't know.
I can't remember. They did Nearly Roadkill,
Oh,
which
right.
was a novel. And at the end of that reading, um, Kate and I and a couple of other folks were kind of sitting around going, yeah, what could we possibly see, with everything that's happened? What can we have happen in the trans community? What's going to be something that would never happen? And we're discussing all these things, and it's like, we're long past those things. You know, trans people in TV shows. Wouldn't that be something if transgender people could actually be on television? That would be
Playing
wild.
cis people too. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
wild. And like it's so funny because Rachel's talking about this show that she's hopefully going to get, and it's like
Mhm.
the director is very clear that he's like, she happens to be trans. That's not,
Yeah,
it's not really important. She just, I mean, we're not going to make her not trans, but
right,
that's not what her storyline is going to be about. So,
right,
even something like that just trans people can kind of just exist,
right,
in TV shows now, aren't the punchline, aren't the,
right.
I think that's remarkable. So yeah, no,
Yeah,
and I think that's one of the reasons for the series, like understanding that, like, yeah, that hot wish list you might have put together in the early 90s, it's
it's
like half
done.
the even wishes done. We did all that. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's good.
long
I
before
did.
we ever
I did.
pictured it.
Yeah.
Long before it was ever pictured. And so now there's new horizons,
Yeah.
and I think that, yeah, we're in a very difficult time with all the laws that are being passed, all of the lies that are being spread. Um, there are lots of battles that, frankly, we're losing, but I don't think we're losing the war just yet.
Agree.
We're seeing so many changes um, in these next generations as far as trans acceptance and trans. I don't, acceptance doesn't even seem like the right word at this point. Acceptance to me is, it feels too small. It's just our existence is just present.
Yeah.
It's not being accepted so much as it just is.
I
Um,
I say to people all the time, I wish upon everyone that they get to a point where they kind of forget who in their life is trans, because I do it all the time
exactly.
now, and it's like it doesn't even matter. And every once in a while, I'm like, oh right, yeah, oh yeah, it's just completely slipped my mind. It's been however long I've known you that it just doesn't occur to me that that's necessary. And depending on the person, right? For some people, their transness is very important to them, and for others,
Right.
it really isn't. They want to talk about music all the time, and the trans thing once they transition doesn't come up. So
Yeah.
really depends. And I hope for more of that, I think, in
Yeah.
general, that as much as identity politics can be empowering and amazing, it can also feel very delimiting. So
Right.
yeah. Well, this has been amazing. I'm so glad we're at the hour and a half, and we're probably over the hour and a half. But I am so glad we got to do this.
Likewise.
Just for the audience, like I had to talk went into it a little bit. So I am very glad that you were willing, and your stories are amazing. And
Yeah.
Yeah, Shoulders of Giants. You are absolutely on this list for me. So, as much as we probably had a couple of cranky interactions at some point in time, so did we all.
Mhm.
But thank you so much.
I'm feeling very self-conscious about my shoulders now because you keep saying that. It's like, well, they're not that big, really.
Oh, they don't have to be big to withstand the appreciation of. And I'm not gonna say I'm not particularly younger, but you were on the scene before, so it's that's a thing. It's amazing to have been like the young upstart, and now I'm like the old. We're like the old. So, and then I'm like, yeah,
I
but there's
think
people
of
20, 30s older than me
Yeah.
who are still kicking.
See, and
So,
I think of myself as a young upstart compared to,
yeah,
oh, for example, Dallas
yeah,
or
oh,
Phyllis or all these people that came before me.
yeah,
Um, I wouldn't have been able to do anything if they hadn't been out there writing the stuff they did. I mean, Sister Mary Elizabeth, Jude Patton, all these people that date back,
yeah,
um, that really made the world a place where I could thrive.
yeah.
I see you
And that
writing down those names.
that's exactly. Well, it's I make a list every time I talk to somebody, and it's just like who more can I interview? So trying to at least keep track. And I will probably at some point follow up with an email too to just go, here's some of the stuff I wrote
Sure.
down. Have you remembered anybody else? But Dallas and
Right.
I in particular are trying to make sure we have like, Dottie and Allison and there's all sorts of people. So trying to make sure that I can at least for people I can't interview, I would like to make sure I can get a profile about
Right.
with maybe words. So as I put this together, I mean this is going to be Kate said, this isn't going to be like a 2-year project. I was like, I know it's going to be 10 years, but I want to start
Yeah.
at least getting some stuff up so that
Yeah.
people understand what the project looks like and um, yeah, it
I
can
mean,
be used
so
as a
much of
resource.
so much of our history as a community, a movement, whatever you want to call it, um, is a history isn't that's behind closed doors,
Yeah,
that is not um, it's not big and out there. You look at things like the Casa Susanna documentary from not too long ago, and that's barely scratching the surface of so much that was going on at the time because they could only do so much.
yeah,
And that's only there. That's not talking about stuff that was going on out on this coast. Um, there's so much forgotten history um, that is out there that is in someone's shoebox that we may never know about.
yeah. Have you seen there's
Uh,
a book that came out like a few years ago that somebody found the photographs of their dad,
mhm,
and I forget the name of
yeah.
it right now, but it's this beautiful photographic book. But it
Mhm,
was for me, it was like talking, it was like, I don't know who I was talking to, but like the whole MTFFTM thing and like TGSO and all of the language that we used to kind of try to figure out what we were doing. And it's like, yeah, but there were whole communities and cultures, like the trans conferences that I went to when Rachel and I were
yeah.
first doing the thing. And it's like, and these had been going on for 10 years, 30, 20, before
Yeah.
that. And yet that feels like ancient history to go, if I say to a student, I met Virginia Prince, they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah,
That's exactly who I was just going to bring up because I can remember going to some of my first trans conferences, the California Dreamin' conference back in 93, 94, out here, and Virginia Prince is there holding court, and Joanne Roberts, and so forth. And it's like, this is an entirely different generation from me that's out there, that was out there doing things, back when I was still probably in diapers.
yeah.
Um,
So Virginia
that
was wildly imperfect, but heroic.
wildly
Also
so.
that, also that.
Yeah, yeah. Did I enjoy that time sitting across from her at lunch at California Dreaming? No, no, I did not, because we had fundamental disagreements in the way the world works.
Oh yeah,
I, however, did know to bite my tongue. And, in the years since, it's like, yeah, that's the world that she grew up in, and that's the community she grew up in. it's not where we are today any more than, when um, Sophia wrote college student wrote a autobiography or a biography on me, I should say. And, one of the first things we're discussing is, well, how did you find that information out? And I had to explain that, well, there wasn't a Google then, because,
I know. There are times
you
like
know,
I just had to explain that you had to pay for texts. Too
yeah,
young.
that's why you had text speak. Um, and so I know that when I'm talking to young trans people today, I know that I might be a little bit more open than most. God, I hope, but I'm veering into Virginia Prince of my time territory. Well, okay, I'll never be to that level, but to
She
that
was also
generation.
cranky and very opinionated. I don't think you have any of that, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, this is true. This is
But the
true.
generational restriction starts to feel pretty
Right,
profound at some point where you're
right,
like, can I even get it? Like, am I still kind of going, I don't, why is everybody non-binary? I don't, okay,
right.
never mind,
Um,
but I'm glad.
a a coworker of mine over the last 2 years has gone through her transition, and she came to me as I was an early mentor for her, and it was really telling for me to try to help her along, um, and realizing just how many years had passed, and that I could give some of the very like nuts and bolts, like, make sure you have lots of lube and pads and so forth after surgery, kind of, specific things like that. But I couldn't tell her anything about what surgeons were doing what nowadays. I have no idea. My surgeons passed away at this
Yeah,
point,
right.
you know?
Well, it's
Um,
like, and also trying to say, there used to be five, and
yeah,
we
yeah,
all knew all five of their names, but
yeah.
that hasn't been true
Uh,
in 15 years.
Menard, Schrang, Meltzer, Stupor, and there was one other. So yes,
Yeah,
there used
that's
to be
wild.
five.
There was the guy here in
It's just
Wisconsin. I always forget who that was.
Schrang. That was
Trying.
Dr. Eugene Schrang.
Yep.
I had some very intimate moments with him back in the day.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that's what we had.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to watch, through her eyes, see the change in where the community is, where our support is.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Just the sheer availability of trans medical care blows my
mhm,
mind. It may be under fire, but the fact that there's something to take away is still a development, right? It's like trying to explain that and going like, no, none of this was recognized as medical care
right,
when
right,
I showed up. And that's only 20, I know only 20 years to a 20-year-old sounds ridiculous, but it's still only 20 years ago. It's not,
right.
5,000 years. So it's not, it
At one
wasn't the
time,
70s. It was the early aughts.
right,
So
yeah,
yeah. Anyway,
exactly.
cool. Well, thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Um, be well and let's
Take
talk
care.
soon. And I'll send you a
All
link if
righty.
I do, whatever I end up doing with this. So
Okay. Sounds
thank
good.
you. Bye.
Bye.